Before joining the FRC team, I served 8 years as a member of Congress and was, in fact, an original member of the House Freedom Caucus, which probably arguably had perhaps its most prominent public moment this past week. That was when a core group of Freedom Caucus members led negotiations for the necessary concessions for Kevin McCarthy to be elevated to the Speaker of the House, but also negotiations to literally change the environment of how the House of Representatives works. But since its establishment in 2015, the Freedom Caucus, you may not be aware, has now started a State Freedom Caucus Network aimed at keeping state legislators in line with conservative principles. And given the recent successes of the House Freedom Caucus in Congress, I can't help but imagine that many of those state legislators are emboldened now to take a stand. And joining me to discuss this is Andy Roth. He's the president of the State Freedom Caucus Network. Andy, I want to welcome you to Washington Watch. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jody. It's a pleasure.
Well, listen, it's our pleasure, and the work that you're doing probably many people are not aware of. But first of all, let's begin with your reaction to the overall results, if you will, that were gained by the House Freedom Caucus this past week in Washington.
Yeah, before I started the network, I'd been on Capitol Hill for 20 years, and I can say without a doubt that last week was the most inspiring week I've ever had in those 20 years. What the House Freedom Caucus did, what they stood for, was amazing. And they have, to your point, inspired the entire country, not just the voters, not just the conservative movement, but also the conservative state lawmakers who are fighting in the 50 state capitals, the 50 swamps, as you will. And what House Freedom Caucus did now gave wind to their back. And it's just been exciting ever since last week to work on that effort.
Well, let's just go a little bit further in that. I mean, I can't help but imagine that you're totally correct in that. The legislators saw what was happening in Washington. They see a group of 20 people and others that are taking a stand. It had to embolden them. As legislatures now all across the country are going into session, many of these people had to be emboldened. First of all, how many State Freedom Caucus chapters, for lack of a better terminology, how many are there, and just how emboldened do you believe they're going to be as these various states go into session right now?
Yes. So the State Freedom Caucus Network launched almost a little over a year ago now. And since then, we have been able to spin up 10 State Freedom Caucuses. The first one was in Georgia, your home state. And then we followed that up with Mississippi, South Carolina, and 7 others. And let me just give you one example. In South Carolina, the South Carolina Freedom Caucus has been fighting for conservative values left and right. They were able to shut down a transgender clinic, and they didn't have to vote on anything. They didn't propose any bills. It was out of session, and they merely called out a hospital for performing this child abuse and said, we're going to look at your funding. We're going to look at any laws that you may have broken, and we're going to investigate this. And like a cheap suit, the hospital folded and they shut down that clinic. And get this, the Republican leadership in the South Carolina House has been so upset with the South Carolina's Freedom Caucus's behavior that they forced all Republicans in the South Carolina House to sign a so-called loyalty pledge. And the South Carolina Freedom Caucus refused to do so. Part of the pledge prevented them from taking a picture of the vote board on the South Carolina House floor because leadership deemed that to be misinformation. And so there is a big battle right now to kick the South Carolina Freedom Caucus members, all 19 of them, out of the GOP caucus. But the Freedom Caucus is not going to bend. They're not going to break. And they're not breaking because of the inspiration they got from the House Freedom Caucus last week. That's just one example. I can tell you others.
That's amazing.
States. Yeah,
that's amazing, Andy. You know, we've only got a couple of minutes, but we focus so much these days on national politicians, and to some extent, understandably so. but government actions are really felt at the state and local level. So explain to our viewers and listeners just how influential state legislatures really can be and, in fact, are.
Well, think about it. All of the big issues right now are at the state level. Yes, there are some national issues that we have to worry about, and thankfully we have the House Freedom Caucus to focus on it. But think about it. After Dobbs, abortion is a big issue, school choice, election integrity. These are issues that can only be fought in the state capitals. And the establishment is well-funded, well-staffed. So are the bureaucracies that run state government. So are the lobbyists. But the lawmakers, they're part-time. A lot of people don't know this, but they're part-time. And that means they don't have all the resources that the establishment has. So what we do is we take our freedom caucuses and we give them that support. We give them financial support, staff support, so they can effectively fight back against the establishment on these big issues that we're talking about.
Andy, we've got about 30 seconds before we have a hard break. What would you do to encourage someone who wants to get involved at the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to our website at statefreedomcaucus.org. We've got a big map of the United States on the front page of the website. If they see that we have a Freedom Caucus in their state, reach out to those lawmakers. They're listed on our website. You tell them, give them an attaboy. And if you don't see your state on there, reach out to us and ask us how we can help bring one to their state.
Andy Roth, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Washington Watch. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.